There is a kind of person in this world where things just seem to work out. Not because they are luckier than everyone else, and not because they try harder or know more, but because somewhere along the way, they stopped blocking something that was trying to flow through them the whole time. You've seen this before, even if you never had the language for it. A musician sits down and plays something that takes your breath away. And when you ask how they did it, they can't quite explain it. A painter moves her brush across the canvas, and the result feels alive, as though it painted itself. An athlete makes a move so impossibly timed that the commentators call it miraculous. And something about that word feels right. Not miraculous in the religious sense, not a violation of natural law, but miraculous in the way that the result exceeds what deliberate effort alone could ever produce. Alan Watts spent decades studying a quality that the ancient Chinese and Japanese traditions recognized as the mark of true mastery. They had a name for this quality, a word the ancient Chinese called ti, meaning virtue, but not virtue in the moral sense the Western world typically means. Not virtue as in being a good person, following rules, or earning approval from some higher authority. Ti is virtue in its original meaning, the sense of power and potency, the kind of inner force that makes a thing fully and authentically what it is. A tree has the when it grows exactly as a tree should grow, without consulting a manual on how to be a tree. Water has the when it flows downhill, finds the cracks, and fills the empty spaces without anyone instructing it. A cat has the when it moves with that liquid grace that no amount of deliberate training could artificially produce. Ti is what happens when something is so completely itself that it becomes a source of effortless power. And here is where this teaching becomes uncomfortable for the modern mind. We live in a culture that worships technique. The self-help industry has built an entire empire on the idea that if you just find the right method, the right affirmation, the right visualization sequence, the right morning routine, you can manufacture the life you want through sheer force of effort. And there is a subtle violence in that approach that almost nobody talks about. Because the moment you pick up a technique and say to yourself, I am going to use this to change my reality, you've already made a statement about who you believe yourself to be. You've said, in essence, that you are not enough as you are right now. That you need this tool to become acceptable, this method to become powerful, this system to become worthy of good things happening to you. And so the technique becomes a confirmation of your insufficiency, even as it promises to fix it. Watts understood this paradox deeply. He called it the problem of the one who tries to be genuine. The moment you try to be natural, you've introduced something unnatural. The moment you try to relax, you've created tension around the act of relaxing. The moment you try to stop trying, you are still trying. This is not a clever riddle. This is the central paradox of human consciousness. And the Taoist masters who first articulated the concept of Ti understood that this paradox cannot be solved through more effort. It can only be dissolved through a completely different kind of understanding. Consider what happens when a master calligrapher picks up a brush. There was a famous principle in classical Chinese and Japanese art. That superior work must have the quality of an accident. Not a faked accident, not someone performing spontaneity for an audience. But the genuine thing, a stroke so alive, so perfectly imperfect, that it could never be reproduced by someone carefully following a set of instructions. The calligrapher who has spent 40 years with the brush doesn't think about technique when the moment comes to create. The brush moves, the ink falls. And what appears on the paper has a quality that no amount of careful planning could have produced. Watts expressed this with stunning clarity. In his own words, he wrote, "What the culture of Taoism and Zen proposes is that one might become the kind of person who, without intending it, is a source of marvelous accidents." Let that settle for a moment. Not someone who creates miracles through force of will. Not someone who manifests through sheer determination and the right technique. But someone who, by virtue of what they have become, is a walking source of extraordinary happenings they never planned. This is a completely different orientation toward life than what most spiritual seekers are practicing. Most seekers are trying to get somewhere. trying to reach a state, trying to achieve a vibration, trying to unlock a hidden power. And the paradox that Watts kept pointing to, again and again, is that all of this trying is the very thing standing in the way. Think about what happens when you watch someone who is truly comfortable in their own skin. Not performing comfort, not projecting confidence they don't actually feel, just genuinely quietly at ease with being alive. There is a magnetism to that person that has nothing to do with appearance, wealth, or status. They walk into a room and the atmosphere changes. Conversations deepen around them. Opportunities appear without being chased. Coincidences multiply. Things fall into place with a grace that defies strategic explanation. And if you ask that person what their secret is, they'll look at you with genuine confusion. Because from their perspective, they aren't doing anything special. And that is exactly the point. Tea cannot be acquired the way you acquire a skill. You don't practice the way you practice piano scales or memorize a list of affirmations. Tea is what remains when you stop performing, when you stop pretending to be something other than what you naturally and already are. The Tao Te Ching, the ancient text that Watts studied with great devotion, captures this principle with breathtaking simplicity. Lao Tzu taught that the highest virtue doesn't think of itself as virtuous. And for this very reason, it truly possesses virtue. The lowest virtue never forgets its own virtue, and for this reason, it has none at all. Think about what that means. The person who is consciously trying to be good, trying to be powerful, trying to be spiritual, trying to be worthy, is the one who misses it entirely. The person who has forgotten to try is the one in whom the power actually flows. This is not laziness. This is not an excuse to abandon effort and do nothing with your life. This is one of the most profound statements ever made about the nature of authentic power. Consider how nature itself operates. A flower doesn't try to bloom. It doesn't wake up in the morning and set an intention to be beautiful. It doesn't visualize its petals opening or repeat affirmations about its worthiness to receive sunlight. It simply grows. And in that growing, which is completely effortless and completely natural, it becomes one of the most beautiful things on earth. Watts often used the image of flowing water to illuminate this principle. Water doesn't try to find the path of least resistance. It doesn't strategize about how to navigate around the rocks in its way. Water simply flows, and in that flowing, it accomplishes things no amount of rigid force could accomplish. It wears away mountains. It carves canyons that stretch for miles. It sustains every form of life on this planet. And it does all of this without a single moment of trying. The ancient masters would say that water has perfect te. It is so completely itself, so entirely without pretense that its power is absolute. Now here is where this teaching moves from philosophy into something that can genuinely transform your daily experience. The reason most people feel stuck, despite having read dozens of books and practiced hundreds of techniques, is not that they haven't found the right method. It's that the entire orientation of seeking is pointing them away from the very thing they are looking for. Every time you pick up a new technique and think this will finally fix you, you reinforce the belief that you are broken. Every time you chase a new teaching and think this will finally give you the power you're missing, you reinforce the belief that you are powerless. Every time you set an intention to manifest something and think, if I do this correctly, I'll get what I want, you reinforce the belief that you are separate from what you desire. And that belief in separation is the only thing that was ever in the way. Watts described this with characteristic directness. He said that the person of tea produces marvelous results, in the same way that tall trees grow in mountains and valleys form at the bottom of hills. There is no elaborate explanation for it. It simply happens because it is in the nature of things. There is something deeply liberating about this idea if you allow it in. It means you don't have to earn the right to have a good life. You don't have to master 17 techniques before you are worthy of experiencing joy. You don't have to reach some elevated state of consciousness before the universe starts cooperating with you. You just have to stop interfering with what is already trying to happen. There is a story from the Zen tradition that Watts loved to tell. A student approaches the master and asks, "How do I achieve enlightenment?" The master replies, "Have you eaten your rice?" The student says, "Yes." And the master says, "Then wash your bowl." The student is searching for something extraordinary. The master points to what is ordinary. Because in the Taoist and Zen understanding, the extraordinary is hidden inside the ordinary. The miraculous is concealed within the completely natural. When you eat your rice with full presence, when you wash your bowl with complete attention, when you walk down the street without your mind racing ahead to the next obligation, or dragging behind yesterday's regret, you are practicing the only thing that truly needs to be practiced. Not a technique, but presence and naturalness, simply being fully what you already are. And this is where the modern mind resists. Because we've been conditioned since childhood to believe that more effort equals more results. We've been taught that the people who try hardest are the ones who win. That discipline is the highest virtue, that if you just work harder, push longer, sacrifice more, you will finally arrive at the life you deserve. But arrive where? Watts asked this question with a smile that contained centuries of wisdom behind it. He observed that we are living in a culture hypnotized by the illusion of time, where we believe happiness is always in the future, always around the next corner, always waiting just beyond the next achievement. And so we run, and we keep running. And we never notice that the thing we are running toward is the very ground we are standing on. The person where miracles happen by accident is not someone who figured out a better way to run. They are someone who stopped running entirely and started being. This doesn't mean they are passive. It doesn't mean they sit in a chair and wait for the universe to deliver packages to their door. It means that their action comes from a fundamentally different place. When action arises from anxiety, from fear, from the desperate need to control every outcome, it carries a quality of strain that shows up unmistakably in the results. Relationships formed from neediness carry the mark of neediness. Work produced from anxiety carries the quality of anxiety. Goals achieved from desperation arrive feeling hollow, as though you reached the summit only to find it empty. But when action arises from naturalness, from the overflow of simply being fully present and fully alive, it carries a quality that everyone around you can feel. You've seen this in someone who loves what they do so completely, that their work feels effortless to witness, even though enormous dedication went into it. The effort is invisible because it was never experienced as effort. It was experienced as play, as expression, as the natural unfolding of who that person truly is. This is the inaction. And the remarkable thing is that this quality produces results that look from the outside like miracles. Doors open that no amount of pushing could have opened. People appear at precisely the right moment. Opportunities arrive that no amount of strategic planning could have manufactured. And the person at the center of all this is usually the least surprised by any of it. Because from their perspective, they weren't doing anything special. They were simply being themselves. Watts pointed out something crucial about this process. When you deliberately try to be natural, when you carefully rehearse spontaneity, the result always feels slightly off. There is always a visible seam, a trace of effort showing through, the way a forced smile never quite matches a genuine one. But when that natural power flows without obstruction, the result is genuinely beyond what effort could achieve. It has no seams. It carries no trace of the one who produced it. It simply is. And something in you already recognizes this truth. Not because someone told you, not because you were convinced by a clever argument, because you felt it operating in your own life. Those moments when you stopped overthinking and something beautiful happened. When you let go of trying to control a conversation and suddenly said exactly the right thing. When you stopped forcing a creative project and the idea arrived fully formed, as if from nowhere. When you surrendered a relationship to whatever it was going to be, and it became more intimate than all your efforts to fix it ever could. These weren't random accidents. These were expressions of your own flowing through you in the moments when you stopped blocking it. As this understanding deepens, something begins to shift. Not through effort, through seeing. You begin to notice the moments when you are forcing, when you are gripping, when you are performing a version of yourself that you think the world wants to see. And in that noticing, without any effort to change anything, the grip naturally loosens. Not because you commanded it to, but because awareness itself dissolves pretense the way sunlight dissolves fog. You begin to speak with less calculation and more honesty. Not because you are practicing authenticity as a technique, but because the mask starts to feel heavier than the face beneath it. You begin to move through your day with less urgency and more presence. Not because you memorized a mindfulness routine, but because the race you were running suddenly seems less convincing than the ground beneath your feet. You begin to let things happen instead of making things happen. And paradoxically, more happens than ever before. This is the quiet revolution that Watts pointed toward throughout his entire life of teaching. Not a revolution of doing more, a revolution of being more fully what you already are. The Tao Te Ching offers a principle that Watts returned to again and again in his later years. Lao Tzu wrote that the way of heaven is to benefit and not to harm, and the way of the sage is to act and not to compete. To act and not to compete. To move through the world as a force of nature rather than a contestant in a race. This is the person where miracles happen by accident. Not because they learned the right technique, not because they unlocked some hidden code, not because they tried harder than everyone else, but because they became natural, they became real. They stopped performing and started being. And in that being, the universe recognized itself. Watts expressed the essence of this truth with characteristic simplicity. In one of his most remembered reflections, he said, "The meaning of life is just to be alive." It is so plain and so obvious and so simple. And yet everybody rushes around in a great panic, as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. You don't need to become this person. You need to stop pretending you are not already this person. The tea is already there. It has always been there. It is your nature, as surely as flowing is the nature of water and growing is the nature of trees. The only question that remains is whether you will continue to obstruct it with effort, or finally trust it enough to let it move.